The state also had their witnesses go out and examine the various focus districts and take pictures of how wonderful the facilities were and how wonderful their computer labs were and their libraries were. And then with our witnesses, we pointed out that, well, you know, some of those structures you pointed out as being so great, they've been condemned by the local building official and they have to be torn down. This computer lab that you say is so great, well, actually, we can only plug in 3 of those computers at a time because the wiring in our building is so bad, it blows the whole circuitry if we plug in more than 3 at a time. Or, you know, that library that looks so good with all those new books, actually, they're just new book covers. The books are still old and outdated. We couldn't afford the books, so we just bought new book covers so it would look nicer. That's a flavor of some of the things that came up in trial. Now, this chart, we now have new and improved charts, which again are on these websites that I told you, not only for the state as a whole, tying them to the source in the F-196s, but also several of the school districts across the state to show that gap. Now, another thing that the state made a big deal of is, you know, we're making progress. And so we made a big deal of the fact, well, they've been intending to make progress for over 30 years. You had Dan Evans back during the initial Seattle School District case that said, now it is important to provide long-term, consistent, and dependable financing for basic education. That was over 30 years ago. You had Dixie Lee Ray. We have already delayed too long. Full funding of K-12 is mandated by the courts, and we should do it now. You had similar quotes from Governor Spellman, Governor Gary Locke, Christine Gregoire at the beginning of her term, all saying that they were going to now start fully funding. We also introduced into trial all the reports and studies that the state has done over this course of time. Some of them included, for example, the final report of the Basic Education Finance Task Force, which, well, I won't go there, but the Finance Task Force, which plotted out exactly a program of basic education, plotted out how much it would actually cost, and came up with a $7.5 to $10.1 billion cost number for that. The state introduced an exhibit where they had some of their people figure out how much it would cost to implement 2261 if, well, you actually did things and actually funded it. And his number came to $9.7 billion. We had from the Superintendent of Public Instruction their estimates of $3.2 billion every single year. We had the reports from the state on just transportation funding alone, where they not only had calculated how much it would cost to actually fully fund transportation, they calculated by school district. So for example, you can look at their calculations, and they have for Bethel, they know they are underfunding Bethel by $4,384,205. They know to the dollar. They also have calculated, and that's right there, they've also calculated to the dollar how much it would cost to fully fund transportation in our state. And they calculated at $337,236,250. They know the numbers. They just aren't funding the numbers. With respect to the 2261 excuse that the state was making, say, hey, Judge, trust us. We've got a plan. We're going to do this. We pointed out that, remember back in the 1977 Basic Ed Act, it said, commencing in the 80-81 school year, reimbursement, and this is for pupil transportation, will be at 100%, or as close thereto as reasonably possible. Okay, so we're over 30 years later, and the OFM does a study and says, well, we're at 65%. JLARC does a study showing the underfunding. OFM does that study, and OSPI does a study. $150 million is the current estimate that OSPI has for underfunding of just to and from pupil transportation. We're not even talking about, you know, field trips and activities and things like that. One other thing that came up is, you know, you have to always be careful when you write emails when you're in the government because, you know, they're like subject to being discovered. And one of the points we made about 2261 is it was a no-cost excuse. They weren't actually funding anything. They were just coming up with words that they could say. And so there's one email from one person from the government on the basic ed proposals and notes that on a lighter note, and this is right before the session that passed 2261, I should tell you that the legislature will be a veritable cornucopia of ideas on no-cost options. And that's exactly what 2261 was. It was a no-cost option. So what did the court rule? Going back to the purpose of Article 9, Section 1, and what we wanted to emphasize first was, you know, it's not just some empty words on a piece of paper. It actually has meaning. And the judge found now that it actually makes sense that Article 9, Section 1 mandates that it is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children. You notice I always emphasize those words, paramount, ample, all, and education. The judge found, and every time I refer to a paragraph here, this is a paragraph of the judge's ruling, a well-educated population is the foundation of our democracy, our economy, and the American dream. And he pointed out especially, not only does it deal with, it's essential to our judicial system and our society as a whole and our economy, but it's essential to equality. Education operates as the great equalizer in our democracy, equipping citizens born into the underprivileged segments of our state with the tools they need to compete on a level playing field with citizens born into wealth and privilege. The state's education duty is the only duty that is its paramount duty, and each child in our state has a paramount constitutional right to the education that's specified in Article 9, Section 1. Our Constitution matters, and education matters. With respect to that word paramount, remember, part of the state's defense was, we've got a lot of important things to do. We have to, build bridges, bore tunnels, deal with health care, all kinds of stuff. It's just one of many important things, education. And our position was, well, no, paramount actually means what it says. The judge ruled in our favor. Paramount is not a synonym of important. Paramount means the state must fully comply with its duty under Article 9, Section 1 as its first priority before all others. As a factual matter, when people are talking about, well, we have to raise taxes for education, et cetera, no, you don't. There is plenty of money in the general fund to fully fund education today, the state's paramount duty. Now, if revenue has to be raised, it has to be raised for these non-paramount things, these other things. But under the judge's ruling, paramount means paramount. Second word that's important, ample. The state's argument was, well, ample means, enough to, eke by. And, in the 2.5 years this lawsuit's been pending, only one of the 296 school districts went insolvent, Vader. So clearly, once you have the state money and other stuff that's cobbled together, that's enough. That's ample. The judge said no. Ample means considerably more than just adequate or merely sufficient. And I have to actually credit, Randy Dorn had a great analogy that I think drove this point home for the judge. He said, if you're the mayor of a town, would you rather have an adequate water supply for your citizens or an ample water supply? You'd rather have an ample one because ample is more than just merely sufficient. And that is exactly what the judge ruled. We go to that word all. The state had basically two arguments. One, there are experts that came in from other states and said, you can't really educate all kids, because of their socioeconomic status. Poor kids, minority kids, they're never going to learn anyway. And so all really can't mean all. And wink, wink, nod, nod, judge, all kids? That just doesn't make sense. And we said, no, all actually does mean all. Judge ruled for us. All means every child residing in our state, not just those children who are more privileged, more politically popular, or more easy to teach. All kids means all kids. Which then brought us to that fourth word, education. Now, remember, one of the state's arguments, and actually a lot of the state officials for the last 30 years have said that word education in the Constitution, that means basic education. What does basic education mean? That's those funding formulas we have. And as long as we can do arithmetic, multiply the funding formula, we're satisfying the education that's required by the Constitution. The judge rejected that. He said that's a tautology. What you're therefore saying is full funding of education is whatever the legislature says it is. Well, then the Constitution has no meaning. Our point was, no, that word education is substance. It's knowledge and skills, and the judge agreed. He ruled that the word education in Article 9, Section 1 is substantive. It means the basic knowledge and skills needed to compete in today's economy and meaningfully participate in our democracy.